welcome along. Empathy, they've all got it. Oh no, wait a minute, that's Kenneth Williams as Julius Caesar in Carry On Cleo. Infamy, they've all got it, infamy. But it is also true that empathy, they've all got it in for you. Empathy was a word that you didn't used to hear a couple of decades back, and then it became all the rage. President Obama said that what he was looking for in his judges was, quote, the depth and breadth of one's empathy. He wanted them to be able to empathize with what it was like to be a teenage single mom. So that's very typical usage of it. People who once upon a time would have claimed to sympathize with you now insist on being able to empathize with you. And if you want a definition of empathy, I like this one from the book Clinical Empathy. There's the clue. By David Berger, who gives the following definition: the capacity to know emotionally what another is experiencing from within the frame of reference of that other person. To know emotionally what someone is experiencing from within the frame of reference of that other person. That's actually quite a hard thing to do if you think about it. The example I always give is a woman called Mariam Farhat, who was a mother of 3, and she used to be a mother of 6. And she was elected to Parliament in the Palestinian Authority as Nidal, mother of the struggle, on the strength of having persuaded half her sons, 3 of them, to self-detonate in the presence of various Jews. And as a result of this, she became a huge hit, as I said, Nidal, mother of the struggle, and she got elected to Parliament in the Palestinian Authority. A mother of 3, formerly a mother of 6, 3 of her kids self-detonated. Now, I can sympathise with Mrs. Farhat's loss. It must be terrible to bury 3 sons, etc. But I cannot empathise with Mrs. Farhat's loss because she doesn't even feel it as a loss. She feels it as a source of family pride and a great entree to parliamentary politics. So I can sympathise with someone who's lost 3 sons, but I can't empathise with someone who sees that as cause for celebration. So empathy, I think, is trickier than it looks. And yet the left talk about it all the time. Empathy. Obama, looking for judges, wants to know about how much empathy you've got. What's interesting to me is that in the age of identity politics, empathy has completely evaporated on the left. There's no attempt now to actually understand, to go back to that David Berger phrase, what someone is experiencing from within the frame of reference of that other person. In an age of identity politics, all you do is label people. In a sense, in the age of multiculturalism, where we have to pretend that everyone around the planet is all the same, like Mariam Farhat and the Palestinian Authority, we have to look for the other amongst ourselves. And in an age of identity politics, that happens all the time. It happened the other day. There was a train crash. You may have heard about it. Big train crash. Amtrak. And there were a couple of people on this train who were Republican legislators who were going to some confab of Republican legislators in West Virginia. So Jonathan Tassini, who is a talking head on CNN, actually thanked her, Mr. Tassini said, because he thinks God is a woman. So he said, thank her, God is working hard today, by which he meant a train full of, as he saw it, goopers, meaning Republicans, crashing. He was happy about it. He went hashtag GOP train wreck, right? Stephen King. Now, Stephen King's a novelist. A novelist has to be able to empathize because a novelist creates characters. And if you have contempt for your characters, you can't create plausible characters. If you have a villain, at a certain sense, you have to be able to empathize with your villain, with what's driving your villain, with the motivations of your villain, in order to create a plausible villain. So a novelist, I don't know what Mr. Tassini does the rest of the time when he's not on CNN, but Stephen King writes all these books. You have to be able to empathize. Stephen King says, a trainload of Republicans on their way to a pricey retreat hit a garbage truck. My friend Russ calls that karma, he tweeted. And Alex Griswold tweeted back at him, karma for who? The innocent truck driver who died or his co-worker in critical condition? This is fascinating to me. Stephen King is rejoicing in a train crash because there were Republicans on the train. Now, it isn't a Republican train. We don't have those. We don't have Democrat trains and Republican trains. It's not Thomas the Republican tank engine with Sir Topham Hatt and all Sir Topham's big bloated Republican pals all riding along in Thomas the Republican tank engine. We do not yet live in a world where Republicans and Democrats take different trains. We do not yet live in a world where straight and gay people or transgendered people have different trains, or Muslim people have different trains. It's just a train. Anyone can get on it. And it's weird to me that empathy can so have drained from our world that Stephen King, a novelist, and CNN talking heads and all kinds of other people think it's Thomas the Republican tank engine, and it's a Republican train, and as Mr. Tassini says, it's hashtag GOP train wreck. It's weird. It's weird to live in a world that talks about empathy but actually doesn't have any. And the interesting thing is that not just the inability to imagine that other people can feel differently, but the refusal to allow them to feel differently. And that's true even with people on the left, people who agree with you on 95% of things. Bill Nye the Science Guy, do you know him? I can't stand him. I regard him, I can't watch that guy. Never watch that guy, don't get it, don't understand it. And on climate change, he's just a doctrinaire bully for the climate crowd. He's with them 100%. But he made the mistake of attending the State of the Union. And so everyone trashed him again. So it's the fact that he agrees with them on 98% of everything doesn't matter. He just stepped just 2 or 3 inches out of line. Because it's the State of the Union. It's not yet the Democrat State of the Union or the Republican State of the Union. It's not like Thomas the Republican tank engine. There's just one State of the Union. And it's supposed to be for the state, for the union, for everyone. But he made the mistake of going to it. So he got trapped. Margaret Atwood, the great Canadian novelist. Handmaid's Tale. Everybody loves The Handmaid's Tale. They all think it's something to do with Trump. That's Margaret Atwood. She wrote the great, when they were holding the Golden Globes and all those Me Too women were going along in black and saying, this is what Trump wants to do to you. She gave them that. She gave The Handmaid's Tale. It was her gift to the Never Trumpers, to the resistance. And it didn't matter because she spoke up in defense of the due process rights of one of these fellas accused of some shenanigans in British Columbia, I think it was. And so suddenly Margaret Atwood, Handmaid's Tale didn't matter. Trash Margaret Atwood. The inability to empathize. And we see it most of all in the sustained war on the past that is going on. You can pull up an example of it almost anywhere you look. There was a protest in a restaurant in Finsbury Park in London a few days ago. Blighty, it's called. It's a Churchill-themed restaurant. I was in a Churchill-themed restaurant in Östersund in Sweden, heading up toward the old Arctic Circle there, and a very nice restaurant, Churchill-themed, in the middle of nowhere. I don't know why a Swedish town is a Churchill-themed restaurant, but if they'd had it actually in Churchill's own country, there would have been a bunch of London students protesting that he was a racist and a colonialist and all the rest of it, including one guy. I want to get this guy's name right because this is the inversion of history we have now. What is the name of this guy? He's Andy Cuff. Here he is. Here's Andy Cuff. What a beautiful svelte waist he has. Andy Cuff, who said Churchill was a Nazi, right? Churchill, the guy who, after the fall of France, stood alone, along with the British Empire, against the Nazis. The guy who stood alone against the Nazis is the Nazi, as Andy Cuff sees it. You see it in Canada, where a pub, Sir John A. Macdonald's public house in Kingston, Ontario. Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, that name's got to come down. He's too controversial. You see it in the attitude to the Confederate statuary all over the United States, plus the statues of Christopher Columbus and even Jefferson and Washington, because it's very hard to hold the line against all this. You see this in the cancellation in Memphis of the annual summer screening of Gone with the Wind, because Gone with the Wind is insensitive, so-called. If you've seen Gone with the Wind, and if you haven't seen Gone with the Wind, be quick about it because it's going to be banned soon. You'll know that it ends. Oh, I don't want to give away anything. Plot spoiler, I should have said. Anyway, at some point in the film, Scarlett O'Hara says, "Tomorrow is another day," and that's actually relevant to this lack of empathy, because in a world without empathy, today is the only day. We are like Pol Pot now. We are living in year zero. Although in our absurd world, it's basically year zero played as Bill Murray's Groundhog Day. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, used to justify every little bit of modish twerpery when he took over as because it's 2015. Because it's 2015. In other words, simply because it's now, we reject what happened before now. And there is something totalitarian about that. The inability to imagine people as they lived in their own time. Because yes, you can go back and say Winston Churchill had unenlightened views about the subject peoples of the empire. You can say that Edward Cornwallis, the founder of Halifax, Nova Scotia, whose statue has just been taken down, had unenlightened views. He's the brother, by the way, of Lord Cornwallis, for Americans, of Lord Cornwallis, who surrendered to Washington at Yorktown. Lord Cornwallis actually had unenlightened views too, but he lost in America, but he was a successful Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, a successful Governor General of India, and historical figures on that scale are remarkable, and none of them are perfect, and all of them live within the conventions of the time. No matter to what degree they go along with them or push against them. And what's revolting about the present spectacle is the inability to understand that every time has its codes and conventions. History is not a continuous linear improvement. Social progress ebbs and flows. And very few people actually have the courage to do what, say, William Wilberforce did, not just with slavery, but also with the child sex trade, and to take two things that are taken for granted and that even if one doesn't approve of them, are regarded as permanent features of life, very little different from the sky and the ground and the sea and the air, and so kick against them that you remake them. And perhaps what's most revolting about the current inability to understand people in their own time, to understand that a man of the late 19th century does not have the same views on race as people do in Justin Trudeau's 2015, that we revile Jefferson Davis because of his views on slavery. We revile Robert E. Lee. I don't know what Robert E. Lee's views on transgender bathrooms are, but they would almost certainly be cause to remove his statue. But people here are doing no more than doing actually what they revile these figures from the past for. They are basically people who take the majority view now, go along with it. There's no courage involved. There's no courage involved in tearing down a statue of Robert E. Lee. There's no courage involved in disrupting a restaurant with a Churchill theme or demanding that a pub named after Sir John A. Macdonald change its name. But they're doing something, that's just the majority view. That's just the conventions of the age. And you're just some boring person swimming with the tide, but without even understanding and without even being able to understand at all how people live in the context of their times. And it is actually a contempt. Instead of the much vaunted empathy, it's actually a narcissism that despises anything that is not like itself. It's totalitarian. It's not in the least bit multicultural. It's totally unicultural. And it's also cowardly because, of course, it's much easier to go on about, say, Winston Churchill's views on race or gay marriage or whatever it might be, rather than to actually say, look at the many, if you're concerned about gay marriage, look at, say, Islam's views of gay marriage. That's where it all gets a lot more complicated. But it's the tyranny of a hyper-present tense. And it's actually completely new in our world. If you've ever read bedtime stories to children, it doesn't really matter what you read, Little House on the Prairie, Anne of Green Gables, Black Beauty, it doesn't matter. If you read any classic literature to a child, the child doesn't know that this is all happening hundreds of years ago, because a child doesn't have that conception of time, doesn't yet think of the past and the present and the future. A child's mind doesn't think in that way. A child responds to the eternal verities of that story. You're engaged by the human quandaries. The cliche with Shakespeare is that he endures because he understood human nature. And so nobody cares about the doublet and hose and all the outdated lingo, because the human nature is forever. And what's fascinating to me, and what is totalitarian, is that in demanding the past conform to the pieties of the present, we are saying there is no eternal human nature, that there is only the moment, the ever-shifting, the ever-constant year zero. Because as Trudeau used to say, because it's 2015, but that was 3 years ago. So now because it's 2018 and 2015 is ancient history. And the lesson in all this is that when you lose your past, when you surrender your past, whether it's Winston Churchill or Robert E. Lee or Sir John A. Macdonald in Canada, when you surrender your past in all its complications, you are also surrendering your future. because you are breaking the compact that used to be understood between the past, the present, and future, which is our existence on Earth. And there is something, again, not just totalitarian, but actually fascistic in this sustained campaign of historical vandalism, on the refusal to permit anyone who is other than us, in the wholehearted assault on empathy, until you wind up with someone who cannot understand that in different times and different places with different considerations, people thought differently. And there is something disturbing about the physical assault on historical memory going on. There's an old line of Cicero that used to get, when people still knew who Cicero was, used to get quoted far too often. He said, to be ignorant of events before you were born is to remain forever a child. But we've gone way beyond that now. And to despise all that happened before you were born is not merely to be a child, but to be in a juvenile delinquent, in a gang of thugs living in the hyper-present tense and assaulting the inheritance of the past for good or ill. We'll see you next time.